Thanks for having me.
It's a privilege for me, and it's a joy to be talking to you tonight. Masterclass here today.
You must have caught me on a good day.
All right.
But thank you.
Thank you all for coming. It's really an honor to talk to Walter in front of you. I'm sure that each of you could be here moderating this conversation. You see a danger. I'm talking, of course, about the outright lie coming from Moscow towards Russia in the first place, because we want to do this as interactive as possible and as practical as possible, this conversation. Still, without getting too much into the detail, do you think that free press, independent press, is in danger today?
The answer to that is yes, and if you ask me where, I'd say pretty much everywhere, including in the United States.
Really?
Absolutely. I think the difference is much of what I heard in the last hour about the problems that local news are having here are actually not dissimilar from some of the problems that we have, a difference in degree, but not that different. I think I'm quite pessimistic about the future of free expression, certainly in the United States and elsewhere. But I think one thing that distinguishes journalism in the United States is that we have what we think is a firewall against government intrusion. We have our First Amendment. But sometimes because we have these freedoms, we don't watch out for them enough. I think one advantage that Romanian journalists have is that they know what the threat is. They can see it coming every day. And I think from what I understand and what I've learned very quickly I think many Romanian journalists are actually so acutely aware of this that they're willing to fight hard for the rights. And you don't yet see this in the United States, that we're still a little too blasé about the threat to our freedom. I think we're a little bit more on our toes because we had a certain would-be dictator as a president for 4 years, and wherever I go, I try not to mention his name. We're trying to forget. But the forces that are arrayed against us are, number one, they're economic. But number two, in many countries, and we've seen this obviously in Hungary and Poland, that the duly elected leaders decide that they can lead better if the press is silenced. If the press goes, I think Hungary is a more extreme example. And I worry sometimes that we don't have the tools and the resources to be able to fight these trends.
What you just said is it's a menace. I mean, you don't just go to work, you fight for your right to work in a free press.
Yeah. And I think, and this subject has come up in the last 2 months, a fair amount in conversations in the U.S., is the best evidence we have of the importance of a free press in a society is what's happened in Russia. Mm-hmm. That I don't think any of us believe that even Putin could have gotten away with doing what he did if the Russian people were fully informed, particularly about the debacle that the Russian forces have descended into in the Ukraine. But the fact that you have to be pretty sophisticated consumer of news in Russia in order to find out what's really happening, and that the vast majority of the people are not, underscores the advantages to any dictator or would-be dictator of silencing the press.
It's a bit sad to listen all to all of this. Let's get to hands-on and go back to your work in the Boston Globe with your team. Of course, maybe you've just watched the movie, maybe you've watched it before. Spotlight is the story of a story. And I want to use it as a case study to try and talk some practical issues for journalists, new, old, maybe in need or in search for a different perspective. So this investigation focused on sexual abuse by Catholic priests. How did it start? Where did you get the idea of starting this piece?
Well, it wasn't my idea.
All right.
I headed an investigative team at the Globe, which is the longest running investigative team in the United States. It started in 1970. Typically what we did was what many of us do. We focused our attention on corrupt government officials, land deals, shady real estate developers, organized crime ties to, for instance, the FBI, those sorts of stories. We had file drawers full of documents and tips. We could have kept at those kinds of subjects for years. But then we got a new editor. And it was the first, Marty Barron, the first editor of the Globe, to come from outside, which shows, in this case, it's a great example of what a pair of fresh eyes can do to an inbred institution, which the Globe had been. It had always promoted its editors from within. And Marty, the day before he started in the end of July of 2001, read a column in the Sunday Globe about lawsuits against one priest, John Gagan. And the columnist who did this had a line in the column that said, in terms of what the cardinals and the bishops knew about this, she had a line that said, "The truth may never be known." And Marty Barron, when he read that, recoiled. He said, well, we're in the business of finding out the truth. And so his very first day, he said he was going to ask our lawyer to go to court to unseal the records of this one priest. And then we found out that the judge assigned to the case had 16 years of Catholic education, so we didn't think the odds were very good. But then Marty called me into his office and said, I'd like the Spotlight team to dig into the case of this priest and find out what the church knew. And I'm standing there saying, here's a guy who just arrived from Miami. He's never been to Boston. He doesn't even know that the Red Sox are a baseball team. And he is basically asking us to take on the most powerful political figure in Massachusetts. And one of, indeed, the most powerful Catholic clergyman in the United States. He was the senior cardinal, had the ear of the Pope and all of that stuff. So he asked us to look at that, and as I have to admit that when you get a new boss and he asks you to do something, you don't usually say, no, I don't think that's a good idea. So I went down to my troops, my 3 reporters. There were 4 of us at that time. And I said, guess what the new boss wants? And we were so frightened because we knew nothing about this subject that I said, look, let's spend the next several days talking to everybody we could think of who knows anything about sexual abuse of children and just sort of go to school. And we ordered the library to get all the clips of stories that had been written about this case, et cetera. And because we cast the wide net, which is actually a good thing to do on any story, instead of focusing on the one priest, we were sort of asking general questions. By the end of the first week, we met with two lawyers who suggested that this one priest was the tip of a very large iceberg, and that these lawyers knew about a dozen or more other cases where the church had secretly settled and there was no public record, no lawsuit. And so we said, oh my God, a dozen priests? This would be the biggest story that we'd ever had. I had spent my entire career, mostly covering government politics, making it a particular point not to get close to the people I covered.
I see.
Because I think that's a wise way to conduct yourself. And then when we got involved in the church story, I was of such an age. I was I'd like to say I'm in my 50s now, but I was in my 50s 20 years ago, do the math. And I grew up Catholic, and I went to the preeminent boys' Catholic high school in Boston, Jesuit school, and it just so happened that a whole bunch of the people, lawyers, several lawyers, I knew them. And I knew them socially. I'd never covered them. And so I did take advantage of those relationships.
I see.
Mm-hmm. And that's how, but I have to say, meaning no disrespect to lawyers, I think there was a calculation by some of the lawyers that if they talked to us in secret, because they had signed confidentiality agreements, and but I think they calculated that if they helped us, and if the story came out, that there would be, and there was, a flood of new victims who would hire these different lawyers to represent them. And, you know, for every settlement in a case like this, the lawyers get a third to 40%.
Nice.
So I think that the calculation worked, and it worked to our advantage.
In the US, or just the Boston Globe, ready to support you to just follow the research, one story, and not publish anything. For how long can you do this?
Yeah.
And
I mean,
how?
This story was atypical. I mean, you know, first of all, we started reporting the 1st of August. We started publishing in January, so that's 5 months. We took 5 weeks off to cover 9/11. So this was relatively quick from inception to publication. More typically, and I would not invest in a project without doing this, we would take 4 weeks to 8 weeks to do what I call prospecting. So I have a list. I have it written down somewhere, but it's in my head. What makes a good investigative project? It has to be an important issue. It has to be systemic for an investigative team to go after it. You know, if it's 1 or 2 people who got screwed by a government agency, send it to the Metro desk and have a daily reporter spend a day or so on it and publish it as a story. But we have to, because we're investing so much of the paper's resources, we have to be much more choosy. So it has to be a big story. It has to be something that will have an impact. It has to be something that should provoke change. And so once you've checked all those boxes, then you get to the tough ones, which is you have to prove it. It can't be a he said. Mm-hmm. You have to have the documents, you have to have people on the record. It has to be a slam dunk, so that the people that you're targeting can't come back and say, well, you got it wrong, or you didn't get my side in, that sort of thing. And finally, it's more so now than in the past, but we focus more on that government is supposed to look out for, but government often fails. And so we have to have their voices, because you can't get through to readers about the problems that, say, debt collectors are inflicting on poor people who got credit cards, you can't get the legislature and the governor and the court system to care about that unless you hit them right in the face with what actually happened to people who got screwed. I mean, you have your data, you have your numbers, and that's all good, and a lot of that can go into a chart or a graphic, but you have to have those voices. So it's only then that we commit. And the issue I just mentioned, the debt collection series, which we did after the church series, we spent 15 months on that. But it was worth it. Nobody at the newspaper, as far as I know, ever questioned the investment.
Yeah, that's a true investment there.
One of the other things that comes into play here, I hope this is true here, I know it's true in Boston, when you ask readers what's the most important thing that their newspaper does, it's holding powerful people and institutions accountable.
Absolutely.
And so that's what we do. Certainly on the church series, we were thrown into it without prospecting. We had no background on it, and we scrambled, and we were frightened to death of the new boss. But I think in the end, we pleased him.
How did it develop from those pieces? After the first 2 weeks, after the first week, you understood that you had something. Yeah. And then you tried to document it as well as you could. You tried to tick those boxes, or you knew that it would just be huge. Not how long. When did you know that it was a good story?
As soon as we found out that it went well beyond this one priest. Mm-hmm. Remember, I said I thought a dozen priests would be the biggest story that I had ever been involved in. Mm-hmm. And that's partly because when you think about it, the notion that the bishops and cardinals of the Catholic Church were enabling and facilitating the sexual abuse of thousands of children, and they were doing that because they wanted to keep it a secret. It was all about the reputation of the church. If somebody had come to you 10 years earlier than that and said the church is involved in an international criminal conspiracy to protect thousands of priests. I mean, we have 13,000 priests just in the US who did this, right? You would have said, that's crazy, that can't happen. So when we thought that there were 12, that was an unimaginable number. Mm-hmm. It actually turned out in Boston, in the end, it was 250 priests, just in the Boston Archdiocese. So it was mind-boggling. Now, once we had the names of the 12 priests, and then we started to connect with victims of priests, and we found out about other priests, and then we found some court cases that judges had impounded, which they should not have done. So we found other cases there. We did, and a lot of this is really tedious work. Somehow in the movie it comes across as exciting, and what we do is not that exciting. The church had no obligation to file public documents, but they did publish an annual directory, and it lists every priest. And we knew in the cases of the priests that we were aware of that when they got caught, they were sent to treatment and then usually sent to another parish. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, they were put on sick leave or awaiting assignment or assigned to the clergy personnel office. So we knew that about these dozen priests. So we came up with a way of, we went through the directories, and this is if you've seen the film, have you all seen the film? If it's 2 minutes, and I clocked it because it's Hollywood. 2 minutes and 37 seconds excitement in the middle of the film where we go through these books and compile this list of 87 priests. It actually took us 3.5 weeks, and I think there was nearly a move to depose me as the editor by the reporters because it was, you talk about tedious. So for every time we saw a priest's name in a directory being on sick leave, we then researched every directory for every year he had been a priest and inputted it all into this document. And by the way, this is 2002, and I'm not very sophisticated technologically. We had a database guy, Matt Carroll, and he's entering all this information on this document, and it's got vertical lines and horizontal lines, and I went up to him and I said, "What is that?" And he said, "It's a spreadsheet." So it was really my first spreadsheet. So all of a sudden we had 90, and once we got the church's records of those priests, virtually all of them had offended children, all of the ones that we found by going through the directories. I mentioned that the judge who was hearing our motion to give us the records had 16 years of Catholic education. She very quickly ruled that the one priest's records not only were unsealed, but they had to turn them over to the press. And then when we broke our first stories, hundreds of victims came forward. Many of them hired lawyers. The lawyers filed lawsuits. 4 or 6 judges were involved, issuing conflicting rulings about what records would be available. So the chief judge took all those cases away from those judges and handed them back to Judge Constance Sweeney, who had ruled in our favor, and it became a precedent. So every personnel file of every accused priest, when it was turned over to the lawyer for the plaintiff, was also given to us. And you could not take on the most powerful political figure like Cardinal Law without that kind of evidence, because to not have the documents, what we would have been very limited in what we could have reported.
Yeah, so that's the moment when you had really the story. How often does it happen to get it in 30 days? Does it? I don't know. We're getting we are getting postponed, prolonged wait for the document. So yeah, when you have it, it's something really rock solid.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us about the story itself. I mean, you had so much in this. You had huge amounts of data. You had victims. You have emotions, because you must have been affected in an emotional way. You also talked to the people. How do you put this down? How do you organize whatever you have to say in order to make a story that's both powerful, readable, and make a stand for your readers?
When we started to publish, I think this is at the end of the movie, and it's accurate. We expected protesters in front of the paper. That did not happen. We expected nasty phone calls, so we were ready to answer the phones. And because when the story hit, and I think we didn't grasp this at the time. This was the dawn of the internet age. And so our stories went viral. So within the first week or so, we had 300 victims just in Massachusetts approach us because we published our email and phone number, but we had emails from all over the world, from victims of priests in Australia, South Africa, India, of course, Ireland, Britain, Germany. And these were all people saying, you must tell my story too. And one thing we found, and this is actually pretty typical, is a good majority of the victims, we were the first people they had ever told. And I remember, if I could tell this, because sometimes it chokes me up. One day I got a phone call from a man in Maine, which is outside of our readership area. And he told me about how his parish priest had raped him when he was 12 years old. And like other people who called us, he never had told anyone. He didn't tell his parents or his siblings. When he got married, he didn't tell his wife. He didn't tell his children. He didn't tell his grandchildren. He didn't tell his great-grandchildren. He was 87, and this had happened to him 75 years before, and he had lived with it all that time. And if you're a journalist trying to drive down the middle of the road and shoot out the windows on both sides, this is not a story where the other side has any defense. And if you want to be motivated to spend your weekends and your holidays in the office staying on a story, all you have to do is hear one of those phone calls.
Maybe you're tempted to make that emotion a headline, a central line of your story. Yet, you need to bring forth the facts, whatever facts there are, whatever evidence there are, to support your story, which is that emotional. And that with the credit card collectors, debt collectors again.
Yeah.
There were real people's emotions, wherever. So where's the balance? How do you do this? How do you balance emotions versus factual sides of the story?
Yeah. I think, first of all, in the year 2002, we published 600 stories. And fortunately, about a month after we started publishing, the editor assigned 4 more reporters to the Spotlight team. So we had 8 instead of 4. But we wrote a lot about victims and their stories, and in most of those cases, we had the records. So the facts were not in dispute. But what we realized early on, remember what we talked earlier, we were talking about a systemic problem.
Yeah.
We realized early on that as important as it was to write about the victims, it was actually more important systemically to write about the culture within the church that allowed this cover-up to go on. And as we certainly have found out since, it happened in every diocese in the United States. It happened in every country that I know of. The only question was the extent to which journalists in other countries and authorities were willing to go after it. And in a lot of countries where the church and the state are that close, it's been, shall we say, more difficult. But surprisingly, in Poland is a very, very good example, where we know that Pope John Paul II, who is now Saint John Paul II, that when he was the Archbishop of Krakow, he did the same thing. He moved priests around who got caught abusing children, moved them to other parishes. So it went it went on everywhere. And in Poland, starting about 5, 6 years ago, maybe sooner, but journalists dug the story up and forced the Catholic Church in Poland to come clean, not fully clean, but they've now admitted to, I think, hundreds of priests in Poland. The same thing has happened in Germany.
I still want to know, how do you manage to balance emotion with facts, and how do you do? What's your tip? Since we're trying to get to the practical aspects.
You mean, how did we, I mean, we didn't write about every victim we interviewed. We were looking, there were, for instance, not to get too technical, but there were two kinds of child abusers. There are pedophiles who prey on younger children. And Father Gagan was one of those. He probably had 400 victims. And then they're called ephebophiles, who prey on post-pubescent boys and girls, 13, 14 years old. And they tend to have relatively fewer victims. Maybe, God, I hate to say this, maybe only 5 or 10. Yeah. So we focused a lot of our attention on the pedophiles, because we had, my memory is 4 or 5 who were like Gagan, each of them had at least 100 or 200 victims, and doing more reporting on how they got away with it. And one thing we discovered, particularly with the pedophiles, is that other priests, good priests, knew or suspected. And the other thing that surprised me, and I grew up Catholic, and in one of the very few Catholic parishes that never had an abuser. One thing I was surprised at, how many people I know, Catholic men my age, who, including some I went to high school with, who came to me and said, "Oh, we were told by so-and-so, our Sunday school teacher, to stay away from Father so-and-so." And they never said anything, but he was a little odd. So it wasn't that this was unknown, it's just that it wasn't talked about. Yeah. And people were afraid to talk about it, and other priests were afraid to talk about it. So it was that we wrote a lot about the culture of the church and the hold that it had on all of us. You know, I like to say that, and I don't know if this is true for some of you, but I grew up in a suburb of Boston, Melrose, Massachusetts. But I didn't really grow up in Melrose. I grew up in St. Mary's Catholic Church, where the priests were God. And we all had to go to Catholic school, and they had a girls' high school, so my sisters all went to the girls' high school. I had to go in all the way into Boston to the Jesuit high school, but I had to go to a Catholic high school. So the church was such an integral part of the lives of so many millions of people that nobody, you know, if you started to talk about make an accusation against a priest, you'd be viewed with disbelief. And in fact, we had, and this is in the film, 5 years before we started our investigation, a victim who had done research and found other victims came to 2 Globe reporters 5 years earlier and told them that this is an international criminal conspiracy that goes all the way to the Vatican, and they kind of laughed him out the door. And because who would believe it? And it's a good lesson. You know, I've been teaching journalism for 15 years now, and I always have it in mind that at the Globe and many other newspapers, the phones are answered by journalism students who are doing internships. And occasionally they get to do a story, but their first line of defense is they answer the phones. Well, as we all know, people who are aggrieved or have been hurt call newspapers.
Yeah.
And they want to tell their story. And very often, people who call newspapers are what we say in the US, they're off their meds. So here we're leaving it to 19-year-old college students to decide of the last 10 people they talked to who seemed off their meds, which of those 10 really has a real story to tell. And I think in our business, just by the chaotic nature of journalism, we miss many good stories simply because they go flying by us at warp speed, and maybe 5 years later we stumble on them.
We want to know, to hear your questions, so to have them. All right, just thank you, but just not yet, We'll get in a second. I have one more curiosity. There are people trying to ask questions. I've written down something after we met last night. How to train our storytelling. How do you train your students to improve telling the story? What to do?
Well, the first hurdle is always find the story.
Okay.
And the best stories come from the kind of people that journalists don't normally encounter in our daily lives. So journalists are middle class to upper middle class. They went to good colleges. There's a new survey out just yesterday in the US that shows that 96% of US journalists have a college degree. So the best stories are the indignities that are suffered by people of lower socioeconomic status that we don't normally interact with. And so getting young reporters to recognize that and go looking for those stories and learn how to talk to people, how to get people to open up, I mean, that is like a major first step for me as an editor of reporters and as a teacher. But it's the reporting. You know, when I was a young journalist and just starting out, and I couldn't write worth a damn. Probably editors I've dealt with recently still think that's true. But I always thought that a good story was 90% reporting and 10% writing.
Uh-huh.
Now, all these years later, I'd be willing to concede it's probably 70-30. But you can't, you can get a great story if it's well reported. If it's not well reported, I don't care how well you write, it's not going to be a very good story. So it's gathering all the information. When you're doing investigative reporting, it's important to me that you figure out a way to get the information. You know, I think of a good story as having all sorts of concentric circles, and you start at the outside talking to experts and reading, and then you start to, you know, you don't call the subject of your investigation in week one. I mean, you don't want to interview somebody who's important to your story until you know what you're talking about. So the interviewing skills are really critical to any story. And it's tougher nowadays because many reporters, certainly this has been true the last 2.5 years, reporters get answers to their questions by email. If they really want to be close and intimate with a source, they'll call them on the phone. but the idea of sitting down across from someone it's kind of frightening to not just students, but actual reporters. They get apprehensive. And sort of breaking through that barrier, I always tell reporters, I said, well, if you're a little nervous about this interview, think how nervous the person you're about to interview is. That'll calm you down. So that you do all your reporting at some point. The beauty of a team, and I wish everybody could be on an investigative team, is that we sit down and talk about what we're doing 3 or 4 times a week. So in those discussions, when I talk about my reporting, and I found this, and I talked to so-and-so, there'll always be someone on the team who'll say, well, did you ask him this? Of course, I'd say no. Or they'd say, well, you know what, on that subject, I think I know somebody else you could talk to. So it's like having, if you have a 4-member team, it's like having a 5th brain at the table, you know? It's that cross-pollination is a wonderful thing to see. It hasn't happened much in the last 2 years because people have been working from home, but all of those go together. I think sometimes we're storytellers, and a good story has to hit people between the eyes. And in the printed paper, where you get 4 or 5 paragraphs on the front page, and then it says, turn to page 7, if people don't turn to page 7, you're screwed. So in that first 4 or 5 paragraphs, you have to suck them in a way that they must turn the page and stay. And the best way to do that, most of the time, doesn't matter how much data you have, is to communicate the essence of the story through somebody's voice right at the top. To me, to write a lead that has numbers in it, not going to get people to turn the page. So we, writing, you know, when you're publishing a long investigative series, you've got 4 days where you're publishing 5,000 or 6,000 words a day. So the writing can take a couple of months. I remember before I ran Spotlight, I was Metro editor, and a reporter turned in a feature story, and I didn't like the top. So I sent it back. I sent it back with a suggested new lead that was totally different than what. And he came into my office, and he looked like he was near tears. And he said, you know, it's as if you just told me, he'd just gotten married. It's as if you just told me that my wife is ugly, that you've done such damage to my story. So the writing process, I know I'm preaching the converted here, can be pretty intense, and sometimes it can be a little antagonistic. But it's, you know, it's a process that, for us, most of the time works well. What we call, I don't know what you call it here, we call it the kicker.
Kicker, okay.
So to me, I mean, the kicker has to be compelling. And if you've done enough reporting, you've probably already figured out what it is, because you know, and it has to obviously relate directly to the major point, the lead of the story. And if, for those of us who have trouble at the keyboard, and I have extra trouble because I got my first newspaper job, I couldn't type, and I'm still 2 fingers. But you know, I sometimes think, I think of a good long story like a train. It has a locomotive. That's the driving force at the beginning of the story. And it has a caboose, which is related. And then you have 20 boxcars.
Yep.
And I'm not kidding you when I say my trick to writing is once I get the locomotive written, I feel like I've crested a hill. Because then it's a question of figuring out the order in which you're going to present all of the evidence you have and all of the interviews and the voices. So it's a matter of which boxcar goes where. And the key there is obviously between each boxcar is having a good transition. Those are kind of basics for what I think good narrative investigative. Doesn't matter how bad a day we had on Thursday. On Friday morning, we jump out of bed. We just want to get back to the story.
So Walter, please tell us what happened with the cast of the Spotlight movie and with your team.
It was a revelation to myself, and I knew nothing about how Hollywood works. But when they picked the actors, who Michael Keaton played me, and by the way, I loved him because in the mid-'90s, when I was the Metro editor of the Globe, he was the Metro editor in a movie called The Paper. It's a great film. And so it was he and Mark Ruffalo, who played Mike Resendez, and Rachel McAdams played Sasha Pfeiffer. So these actors almost never get to play real people. And they're very good at what they do, and one thing that makes them very good is they're very good at preparation. And given the fact that they had real people, they took full advantage of that. And we didn't mind at all. So when I first met Michael, it was in New York, a month before they began filming in 2014. And when we met, I found out that he had already spent 2 weeks watching video clips of every appearance I had made on Face the Nation or any of those shows. Anytime I'd been on NPR, he had the tape. He already had my accent down, and I have a Boston accent, and he had it down. And then it was a little bit unnerving because, we're reporters and we ask questions of people. People don't ask questions of us. We watch people for their manner. So I'm sitting down to dinner with him the first night, and I realized that he's sort of watching me closely, like even how I held a fork. And my friend Sasha Pfeiffer tells a story. She was out to dinner one night with Rachel McAdams, and they were walking down the street, and she noticed that Rachel was kind of hanging back a few feet. And she stopped and she said, "What are you doing?" And Rachel said, "I'm studying your gait." So they did, all of the actors spent an enormous amount of time with us. And since it was Hollywood and not the newspaper paying the bill, we actually dined quite well.
All right.
Yeah.
Questions? Your questions, please. There.
In the Romanian case, for example, one priest convinced one of the students to record the abuser when he was admitting he abused him in order for him to have a recording to go to his superior and expose the case. So I wonder if in your case, were those priests?
You're asking a 76-year-old man who sometimes has trouble remembering what he had for breakfast today, what happened 20 years ago. But yes, I do remember. I remember at least one case where a priest tried to get the archdiocese to do something about Father Gagan, and the priest got called in and, I don't know if threatened is too strong a word, but he was told to back off and shut up. I think there were a couple of other similar cases, but the church, and we got into the sort of fabric of the church. I'll try and answer this quickly. The church had become very much, and still is, a clericalist society, so it exists for the benefit of the priests and not the faithful. And so there are surveys, Catholic priests Roman Catholic priests take a vow of celibacy, and they can't marry. And of course, but there are surveys that show that half of all priests violate that vow with other consenting adults. And so there is a culture within the priesthood of a long-standing, long-running culture of half or more of the priests are winking at their vows, and it's a secret, and everybody keeps that secret. And so the fact that some priests are taking advantage of 14-year-old boys or 14-year-old girls, that sort of tends to get hidden just because of the culture. So I think one of the most courageous things that happened, and it took months of our reporting for this to happen, is 55 priests publicly signed a letter saying that cardinal law should resign. And that was unprecedented in the church. You just didn't do that. And so that was real courage. But just to finish the answer to your question, the goal of the church, and we have thousands of pages of documents on this, is to it's always about the reputation of the church. Nowhere in any document did it ever express concern about what had happened to the children. Nowhere. But it was always about protecting the priests. So there was no internal impetus at all to do anything about this.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Gabriel. I'm an advocate of nature. I mean this kind of priests operating as spies within the community for the governments or corporations. And if you have done such experiences, how did you handle this in your story? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I don't know the answer to that. I've not heard of priests spying for the government. The one area that remains a secret, remember what we did was all about the abuse of children. One area that has never been explored, and in one case we got priest records by accident, is the number of Catholic priests, and I'm sure this is true in other religions, who took advantage in counseling sessions of vulnerable women. There was an enormous amount of that went on, and it remains hidden. And I don't know of anywhere where those kinds of records have come out. Now that's off the point of your question, but I don't know of any instances of what you've experienced, sir.
We don't talk a lot in Romania about the psychological impact of this type of work among journalists, and I was curious, how did you deal with the emotional burden of this work with your colleagues? Were you aware of this issue? Were you discussing among yourselves? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. We talked to so many adults who had suffered with this for years that it took an emotional toll on us. There were, I'm a tough guy, but there were times when I drove home at night that I cried. My wife, who is a nurse, thought that we all had PTSD. But I'm embarrassed to admit this, I did nothing about it at the time, and I didn't recognize it. And we all kept a stiff upper lip, and we plowed forward, did our stories. And, you know, in maybe the last 10 years, I've been involved in several panel discussions about this. You know, there's more attention now being paid. Journalists who cover wars, journalists who, as we did, spend a lot of time talking to people who are in great distress. We really should have had some mental health counseling. I think it would have helped. I look back on it, I see that as a failure. Not just by me, but at the globe. You know, nobody ever said in 2002 or 2003, you guys okay? It just wasn't. Now I think it's more embedded in the culture that question would come up. But it is a good question, and we could have done more. We should have done more.
Thank you for being so open.
I'm curious to know if you ever did so in print. So in one of the 600 articles, was there ever an article that said the Globe did maybe didn't do as much as it should a few years ago?
You know, that's a very good question. I think that particular scene in the movie is invented. There had been, as I mentioned earlier, signals that we missed early on, and the one thing I always say, if we missed it, one thing every Catholic diocese in the world has is a newspaper nearby. And in terms of the extent of this and the cover-up, we missed it too, but we were the first to get it. So yes, I mean, it's the one lesson, maybe the most important lesson I think we learned as reporters is that we owe the same kind of scrutiny to institutions we cherish, to our iconic institutions, like the Catholic Church, like the local art museum. We owe them the same scrutiny that we give to government officials, because these institutions are also run by fallible human beings. And I think we recognize that better now, certainly as a result of our reporting on this story.
Stories that are now happening and are not being covered as well as they should be in the world. And what are those stories, in your opinion?
There are countless great investigative stories that we aren't getting to, partly because of what's happened to our business. In the US, there are only half as many daily newspaper reporters as there were 20 years ago. So half those jobs are gone. And reporters are under pressure to do more, to get clicks, and so the resources aren't there at most news organizations, but the stories are always there. And one thing that we know is true with the closing of so many papers in the US is the level of corruption has gone up. That if you no longer cover City Hall, who is the whistleblower going to call? So I tell my students, and I don't say this facetiously, when they talk about the movie, I say, you can find a story that is so good that someone will make a movie out of what you did. Let that be your benchmark. Go find those stories, because that's what we do. We don't, and I say this with all due respect to the Boston Globe's sports department, which is one of the best in the country. I like to read about sports, but that's not the journalism that I do or that you do. What we do is we dig out important stories that help people make rational decisions in a democratic society. We hold people accountable. We get to the stories that the people we cover don't want us to know. And those stories are everywhere. It's like low-hanging fruit. And all you need is a discerning eye and the ability to ask questions of people who never see a reporter.
People don't trust journalists, at least here, not a lot. And especially victims of abuse, and I'm not talking just about sexual abuse. Like, you want to publish your story, right? You're after something. Why should they talk to you? Like, what kind of protection can you offer them? They don't want trouble. So I was wondering, what's your advice?
In this story, we benefited from the fact that people came to us in the hundreds, and they wanted to talk. In fact, some of them wanted us to interview them and put it in the next day's paper, and they hadn't told their wives. Not a good thing. So, but I'll tell you, in any story where people have been wronged, to me, the best argument to get them to talk is this. First of all, in the U.S., news organizations do not identify by name the victims of sexual abuse or sexual assault unless they agree to. So that's one level of protection. But I wouldn't say it's an argument, but what I say to people who say, why should I talk to you? I say to them, because if you help me, what happened to you won't happen to somebody else. And that has been, for me and other reporters, the most persuasive case you can make to people. And more often than not, people will think about it and they'll say, yeah, I'm all in.
What would happen if your story was published today in the Facebook era? What kind of reactions would have been?
That's a good question. This new study that's out about the American press that journalists responded to, when they did this survey in 2012, 79% of journalists said social media were a really good thing. That's now down to 21%. So that's part of the answer. My initial reaction would have been, gee, think of the bump we got at the beginning of the internet age. If we had Twitter and Facebook back then, it would have gotten even more reaction. To which Marty Barron, who was our editor, says, no. Social media, if you publish this today, you can imagine the abuse you would get, the counter stories, the fake version, it would be a nightmare. But I think, for all of us, that's the cost of doing business now. You have to confront that. But no, I don't think it would be. I'm glad we didn't have Twitter back then.
When you were asked how to end the story, you said the beginning is important, and then you were asked about the end, but you said the story never ended, basically. Why? Why did you say that?
Because the cascade of revelations around the world, and still in the U.S., 1/3 of the dioceses in the U.S. still haven't come clean. The story continues. You know, more in different countries. In the U.S., the church, I think this is certainly the gravest crisis the Catholic Church has faced in the modern era. Some people say since the Reformation. I don't know if that's the true, but they have such an extraordinary crisis of confidence in the world, and we have a pope now who came in wanting to be transparent and fix that, but he's run up against a very conservative college of cardinals that would rather that nothing change. So the Vatican still hasn't come to grips with this. So that's what I mean when I say the story continues, and I suspect it will, for the impact of it on the church is profound for, I think, quite some time to come, as it should be.
Maybe today journalists are still avoiding to write bad things about the church, so to do investigations regarding religious life. And a second question would be, have you ever felt guilty that maybe you should have done this investigation earlier? Maybe you heard it in a way or another around you, and you didn't do anything?
Yeah, I think on the second question, I think that came up earlier, and we talked about it. Of course, I mean, I wish we had, you know, the clues that were there. I wish we'd pursued them sooner. It would have meant that fewer children would have suffered this. So, yeah, absolutely. And the reason I answer the second question first is because I've already forgotten the first question. What was the first?
Do you feel like the journalists are still avoiding to write about corruption? Avoiding, yeah, write corruption in the church.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've talked to journalists in a lot of countries about this, and there are pressures from their publishers, from government officials. This is very true in Latin America. And it's a very difficult subject to start with. It's difficult to report on, and then, you know, you live in I remember I made one visit to Brazil, which is I think the largest Catholic country in the world. It has 160 million Catholics. And when I went down there, the entire country had a grand total of 19 priests who had been identified as abusing children. Now, if you just do the math compared to Boston, obviously that remains hidden. But when I talked to reporters down there, they had no real appetite to go after the story because civil authorities were not interested in it, and the church was even more powerful than it was in Boston. But on the other hand, as I mentioned, there are some countries I would not have expected, like Poland, where journalists have dug right in and done really great reporting. So, you know, this is one reason I think the story will continue, because I think more and more in more countries, journalists will, I hope, pursue it.
I thank you all for your thoughts and your attention. Walter, you've opened your textbook for us, and you generously lend us some ideas. And for this, thank you. You've opened yourself as a human, and you touched us, and we thank you for that. And of course, it's always great to hear you telling stories. Thank you, Walter.
Thank you.